exciting day it is this morning. We have a special guest today, but before I introduce our special guest, I would like to give some acknowledgments. I would like to take this moment to acknowledge political science professor Kevin Navratil. I think we don't say enough about the contributions that Kevin makes to the college, but I want to thank him for his remarkable work and outstanding contributions to advancing our understanding of the democratic process and also being instrumental in shaping scholarly discourse related to civic engagement. Kevin, we appreciate your tireless efforts and contributions to the college. Let's give Professor Navratil a round of applause. And now, I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker for this morning, Congressman Sean Casten. Congressman Sean Casten, an influential voice in Congress with a proven record of accomplishments in advancing clean energy solutions, combating climate change, and advocating for economic opportunities for all. As a scientist, clean energy entrepreneur, and CEO, and now a member of Congress representing the western suburbs of Chicago, Congressman Casten has dedicated his life to fighting climate change. He draws upon his previous private sector experience in Congress to craft market-based solutions to reduce emissions while creating jobs and spurring economic growth. Casten is the vice-ranking member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee and sits on the House Financial Services Committee, where he is vice-ranking member of the Subcommittee of Capital Markets. He also serves as vice chair on the New Democratic Coalition Climate Change Task Force and as vice chair of the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Coalition. Congressman Casten has a Master of Engineering Management and a Master of Science in Biochemical Engineering from the Thayer School of Engineering and Dartmouth College. Congressman Casten worked as a clean energy consultant and manager at Arthur T. Little, then served as the president and CEO of Turbo Steam Corporation, which focused on utilizing energy recycling technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by generating heat and power from previously wasted energy. That's a mouthful. He's done a lot. In 2006, he co-founded Recycled Energy Development, better known as RED, which focused on recycling waste energy and converting energy facilities to cleaner, more economic uses. From his work in the private sector to his service in Congress, Congressman Casten brings a unique perspective to the table, advocating for policies that promote sustainability, expanding access to health care, and creating economic opportunities for all. Join us in welcoming Congressman Casten as he continues to lead with integrity and make a meaningful impact in shaping policies that drive positive change and foster sustainable growth. Give a round of applause to Congressman.
Thank you. Is that on? Oh. Thank you, President Haney. All of that is far too long. I think maybe the most important thing for this is that I have never taken this class. I was saying to your professor that in hindsight, I probably should have taken some government and poli-sci classes before getting into this line of work. And I say that in part because, you know, I still pinch myself that I get to do this job, that I get to work in the Capitol, that I walk past this little sign on the floor that says this was where Abraham Lincoln's desk was when he had this job. Some of my colleagues also have had this job, and you can judge that as you wish. But I sort of feel like there's a, if number one, I think if you ever lose that awe of just the amazing, you know, power of our government, and that you pinch yourself, you have to do it, then you probably shouldn't do the job anymore. But number two, I'm grateful for you having me here today, because I think part of the obligation is to try to demystify some of what government does and answer your questions. And I want to spend most of our time on questions, but just give you a little bit of sense of, at least, you know, for somebody who's now been in this gig for 5.5 years, and 5.5 pretty eventful years. I was just saying to President Haney that you know, having never served in any elected office before, I've now, you know, been a part of half the impeachments that have ever happened in our country, half the attacks on the Capitol that have ever happened in our country, 100% of the vacated speakerships that have ever happened in our country. 20% of the evicted members of Congress, thank you, Mr. Santos, that have ever happened in our country. It's been an eventful period, COVID, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the wisest things that I've ever seen said about sort of a constitutional democracy generally is to go back and read, if you haven't read it, Benjamin Franklin's speech to the Constitutional Convention, encouraging all his colleagues to ratify the Constitution and to say, and his pitch was like, this has to be unanimous. This has to be a strong message. And the comment he made at the time that I just want to emphasize is he said, when you assemble a group of men, apologies, it was just a group of men, to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interest, and their selfish views. From such assembly can a perfect production ever be expected. And this was how he was making the case to everybody that the Constitution was not a perfect document, that it wasn't a perfect document because it was created and crafted by a bunch of imperfect people. And he went on to say that, he thought we did a pretty good job in spite of ourselves. And I like that quote, number one, because just like one politician to another, game respects game. It is such a classier way of saying, can you believe how much we got done given the idiots I had to work with? That's essentially what he's saying. But the other part of it is this recognition that you can't find any decision that has ever been made in any democracy anywhere where a super wise, smart person couldn't have made a better decision. The idea of what they created was that you can't guarantee you're always going to have an exceptional person making decisions. So this process, as messy as it is and as complicated as it is the best way to ensure that we have a durable democracy. But the things that we're going to do are always going to be the best we can muster given the people in the room, and are going to have some political messiness. And if you go through any issue in the news today or otherwise, if you view it as saying, well, why can't they do better? It's because we were designed to get it right most of the time, not to get it right every time. But the flip side of that is that I think it creates, an obligation for those of us who care about government not to assume that people who had our job before us were better or smarter or more perfect than we are. They were all just as flawed, and we ended up with these systems because of their flaws. And Barack Obama said to me once, I love the fact that I get to say that sentence, that if you view the job of elected office as a road race, you've missed the point. It's a relay. And your job is to take the baton from whoever came before and hand it off to the next person in a little better position than it was when you found it. And I think that's right. And so, if you look at the moment we're in right now and pick any number of issues, why don't we have universal health care? Because the Senate was one vote short of getting that, and in order to get Joe Lieberman on board, they had to take away the universal provision of the ACA, and so we didn't get the full universal, but we got something much better, but not as good as it could have been. Why do we still struggle to get reasonable gun control laws so that you don't have to be worried about your safety? Well, because the votes haven't been there. Not to keep picking on the Senate, but the votes haven't been there in the Senate in spite of the fact that we've passed those rules through the House. That's not knocking the individuals. It's sort of the reality of sort of where these combinatorics go. Why in the Inflation Reduction Act that we just passed, the biggest climate bill ever passed anywhere, did we only get half of the things that the climate committee I serve on was asking for, which was still a big deal? Well, because we didn't have all the votes to get that done. And as you walk back in history and sort of say, what does that mean for our government and where we get it? Don't forget what Ben Franklin said. He thought the people he was working with were just as flawed as I think are the people that I'm working with right now, but you do the best to get the situation. And so the government that our founders created, number one, said slavery's fine, said we don't want black people to vote, we don't want women to vote, we don't trust that Americans can be trusted voting for president, so we're going to create an electoral college. And if you read some of the things in the Federalist Papers, they basically say you can't trust the average person because they're not smart enough to vote for president. We don't think people can be trusted voting for senators, right? That was initially you couldn't vote for senators. And furthermore, the states that were trying to decide whether or not they should join a union that would limit some of their power as states refused to join if there was a purely representative democracy. If you read about the Great Compromise of 1789, we had to create the Senate that was this very distorting non-representative body, not because it was the right thing to do, but because otherwise places like South Carolina said, I'd kind of rather be a sovereign state than part of this United States of America if I have to give up some power I would have as a state. And so we got that compromise, and that's not saying it was right, wrong, good, bad. It was the best they could do, right? And as we go forward, I think if we fetishize what prior politicians did as infallible, unperfectible, then we're not taking Obama's advice to take that baton, bring it forward in a better position. If, on the other hand, we go back and say, who are the political figures who we think most highly of? And in general, they're people who have expanded the definition of democracy. We expanded the definition of democracy with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to end the legacy of slavery, to make sure that people could vote, that there would be equal protection for all citizens, that if you are born here, you are a citizen here. We expanded democracy with the 19th Amendment to allow women to vote. We expanded democracy when we said let's directly elect senators instead of breaking this forward. What do we still have to do? We do still have an electoral college, right? That has created, in two recent elections, has elected somebody president who was not preferred by the majority of the American people. We do still have a Supreme Court where, don't quote me on this, I think I've got this right, the majority of the members of the Supreme Court were confirmed by senators representing a minority of the population of the United States. And so when you ask yourself, like, why is it that government is not always doing things that are popular with the majority of the American people? It's because our founders designed a government to not do things that are popular with the majority of the American people. And that's not to say that they designed a government to protect minority rights. They designed a government to protect a very specific group of minorities' rights, right? And we can fix that and we can improve that. And so I think the challenge, and where I still love this job, and where I think is the challenge for those of us who are in the job now, or those of you who are aspiring to some career in law or politics, is how do you keep that moving forward and have the deep and abiding respect for the institution, for the form of government, while still saying our job is to make it better and hand it off a little bit better to the next generation. And just before stopping, I want to say something that is going to sound a little bit partisan, and I hope you don't take it that way. Let's imagine that we didn't have the Electoral College, that the presidents that we elected were always the ones who won the popular vote. Hillary Clinton would have been president. Al Gore would have been president. They would have appointed radically different justices to the Supreme Court, which means we would not have the Citizens United decision that opened up all of the dark money in politics. We wouldn't have the Heller decision that says that the first 13 words of the Second Amendment are merely prefatory and anybody can own a gun even if you're not part of a well-regulated militia. We wouldn't have had the Dobbs decision that set women's rights back. And if all of those things sound sort of like democratic and partisan, more democratic presidents, more sort of ideas on the democratic agenda, I don't mean it that way as much as to suggest that I think a lot of the tensions we have in our country right now is because there are two ways to accrue power. You can accrue power if you represent the views of the majority of Americans by winning and controlling the House and winning and controlling the majority of votes if it's enough to get through the Electoral College. The other way you can control power is if you control the minoritarian institutions and use those institutions expressly to frustrate the will of the majority by limiting access to voter boxes, by changing the time of elections, by issuing Supreme Court precedents that say that corporations are people and corporate speech is just as protected, and therefore you are not obligated to know who's giving money to political campaigns. These things are all very anti-majoritarian views, and as long as both of those paths exist to power, it's very hard for one view to be coherent. And I think making the reforms necessary to bring us a more representative government would not only create a happier and more stable electorate, but it would also create two much more, I think, competitive political parties, because they would both be playing on the same playing field. They would both be trying to win the view of the majority instead of competing at two very different games. And I hope when you look at politics, when you look at how people are speaking, you understand that people are playing two very different games on the same playing field, and understand what's going on. So I hope that's useful for context. I didn't talk at all about most of the stuff that I do, all the warm things in the introduction, but more than happy to answer your questions on things political or policy, such as I can.
Thank you, Representative Casten, and my American government students can attest. I think it took me 2 days to cover the Constitution and some of the history of the institutions, and you just did it much more eloquently in about 10 minutes. So this is somebody without any political science background. So thank you for that. So my students and we created some questions, and we're happy to open it up too. If there's other questions, we'll get to those. So can you talk a little bit about what made you want to run for the U.S. House of Representatives with your science background? And then a student had asked, especially in the era of job instability, where sometimes you get voted out of office or you lose election, and then kind of the potential for division with friends and family, coworkers, the way that modern politics is so divisive.
So in some ways, I'm kind of a one-trick pony. I got my master's degree in biochemical engineering because I was focused on climate change. I remain focused on climate change. I went to work doing basic research, developing advanced biofuel technology, went from there to working for an engineering firm trying to deploy fuel cells and batteries. Then got the entrepreneurial bug, and I said, no, I don't think this is a science problem, because I keep running into technologies that are completely proven but aren't being deployed. So let me try to start a company to deploy these technologies. And we had some degree of success at that. And then gradually came to the recognition that the biggest barriers to our deploying technologies were the laws of the states in the United States and individual states. Just a crazy fact for you: the efficiency at which the entire fossil fuel-fired part of the U.S. electric grid, which is about a third of U.S. CO2 emissions, they convert fuel into power at 33% efficiency. So 2 of every units of fuel they burn are thrown away economically, environmentally. Thomas Edison's first power plant ever built by anyone in the world, Pearl Street Station in Manhattan, converted 6% of its energy into fuel and then recovered more than half of the remaining energy as heat to heat local buildings, and achieved about a 50% overall efficiency. Can you name any other industry that does a worse job at converting dollars that they spend into dollars that they sell, from the first generation plant to the modern technology? And that's basically because of legal barriers. And so I got involved in some advocacy issues. We sold our company, was trying to figure out what to do next. And candidly, when Trump was elected, I felt like the things that I really cared about were going to go backwards. And I had the financial luxury at that point to take a little bit of time off and think about how to do something new, and decided to do it. And that was how I got into it. To the second point, I just say that I don't think fundamentally there's nearly as much partisanship among the American people as there is among American politicians. I think if you look around to your friends, people you work with, I think we all figure out as humans how to work with people on a project who we may disagree with on some political issue. how to work with people on a project who we may not want to go out for drinks after work with, but they're still good people, right? And I think part of being a human is being able to say, let me find our areas of commonality and not unduly focus on the divisions. I think politics amplifies the divisions, but at least my own experience in politics is that as long as you still bring that approach that we have just as basic human beings, and try not to get distracted by all the temptations to say, let me flag all the ways that I'm different from you, and instead focus on the commonality. I think that's what people do, and as long as we keep doing that, you can maybe not forget about the other piece, but at least ignore it.
Well, a couple of follow-up questions then with that last point. Do you think it's overplayed a little bit, maybe how divided Congress or members of government are, where sometimes people may use social media to kind of play up and get attention and say really kind of outrageous things, whereas behind the scenes, like you might actually get along and I don't know, have dinner together, or be pretty cordial with one another, but sometimes in the media, when you're talking about one another, not necessarily you, but just in general, that there might be more, the way that the American people see it, it's more divisive, but behind the scenes, there's actually a lot more civility.
So there is, with one exception that I want to get to, and let me just start on the positive. It has always been true that if your job involves some part of the public eye, it is necessary and useful for you to have some amped up version of yourself that speaks in short sound bites and says things to inspire people when the camera's on, and speak in somewhat longer paragraphs and more thoughtful and nuanced when the cameras are off, because that's just sort of the nature of communications. And that was true even before cameras. There's a wonderful old line that there was this guy from North Carolina in the pre-Civil War era who was famous for giving just horrifically over-the-top polemical speeches on the floor, and then being a totally nice guy off the floor. And somebody said to him, "What's that? Why are you so different? What's this Jekyll and Hyde routine you've got?" And he said, "Oh, that's for Buncombe County." And Buncombe County, North Carolina, was where he represented. That, by the way, is how we got the word "that's a load of bunk." That's that's all Buncombe. That came from this guy saying, "I'm just doing this to fire up the people in Buncombe County." That district, just because it's interesting, was represented by Mark Meadows, who was just indicted for yesterday in Arizona. When Mark Meadows stepped down, it was represented by Madison Cawthorn. That has always been a place that has attracted people who are somewhat polemical when the cameras are on. But when the cameras are off, we can all say, like, all of us have, a communication incentive to be a little bit more black and white when the cameras are on. Now, the one exception that I said is, and I think this is where it's been difficult in the last few years, is that I think for those who respect the institution and have a little bit of humility, there's a recognition that my opinion on any controversial issue of the day, I am no more entitled to that opinion than somebody else who won an election, and have no more or less right to fight for that opinion than you do. And I think with that respect and humility, you can have people who you may wildly disagree with on policy, but say our job is to represent the people who elected us, the values we have, bring that forward, and we can park that at the door. The exception has really been since January 6th. For those folks who voted to overturn the election, there's just a growing tension right now of saying, if you don't respect the right to be here of people who want a free and fair election, now we have a problem with whether we also respect, your right to have that opinion. And that's been genuinely difficult and has created a lot of tension on the floor. That was also true in the pre-Civil War era, and it's part of why I say this question of how do we get to a government where we can disagree on the issues, but we will be slavishly devoted to the idea that majoritarian democracy is a good way to solve problems. And I think if we can get to that, it takes away some of the more inextricable tensions in Congress.
I wanted to get back to the science background that you have. And I think I read once that climate change and energy policy is your number one issue. And you once said that we have a PhD problem, but but Congress has a 6th grade reading level and trying to solve it. Can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, the short elaboration is we're just out of time. I was never told in any of my prior jobs that I was the smartest person in my office when it came to U.S. energy policy and climate science, and I get told that all the time in my current job, and that scares me. The numbers are just ridiculously scary. When I was born, there were 324 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Every scientist out there, including ExxonMobil researchers, it should be noted, said that there was an ExxonMobil report from the 70s where they said we have 6 to 10 years before we have to make meaningful changes in the way we talk about energy use in this country. This was Exxon in the 1970s. And there was a general recognition that we can tolerate some fluctuation, but we really shouldn't go above about 350. And so Bill McKibben, who's a friend, who's some of you may know him, he's a very active environmental activist. He founded a group called 350.org not that long ago, with the idea that we have to be committed to doing everything necessary to keep CO2 in the atmosphere below 350 parts per million. We're now at 424. Just within my lifetime, that's increased by 50%. The last time that CO2 was this high in the atmosphere, sea levels were 4 to 8 meters higher. It takes a long time to get to that point, but we know that if we stopped emitting all CO2 tomorrow and just froze where we are right now, we've already locked in at least 2 feet of sea level rise, and much of that is like within the near-term future. The sea level rise just on the Gulf Coast in Florida and Louisiana is going to be 2 feet by 2050, which means that if you buy a house in Pensacola, Florida today, it's going to be underwater before you've paid off the mortgage. Like that is the reality that we have locked in. And we are doing, when we sat down on our climate committee, this was 2 terms ago, we said we want to come up with a set of policy recommendations, and we're going to ask outside scientists to evaluate whether what we've come up with is sufficient. And they did a whole analysis of everything that we'd come up with, and this was over the course of 2 years, and we looked at all the existing legislation, and they said what you've got here is 80% sufficient. Now that was a big deal. Like, we were honest about the score. I could make the case that it was probably better than that because they only did the things they could quantify. What we then passed in the Inflation Reduction Act, as I said in my opening remarks, was half of that. So we now have a policy environment in the United States to get us to 40% of where we need to be. That was the biggest climate bill ever passed by any government anywhere. It's a really big deal. Notwithstanding my opening points that like we did the best we could with the people who were on the field, right? But we have to do so much more, and then we have to figure out how to not only cut CO2 but also go backwards to get back to 350, which is really hard. The good news, because I think it is important to have some good news on that, is that most of the change that's happening right now in a positive direction is happening for purely economic reasons. The coal industry is shutting down because it can't compete first with natural gas combined cycles that are cheaper to operate, and now with solar and with wind and with energy efficiency. Electric vehicles are the fastest growing vehicle segment because they are really fun to drive. They have effectively no maintenance costs. The operating costs fall very low. Efficient homes are penetrating through. And so we're seeing the United States has really, in the last 15 years, essentially decoupled economic growth from fossil fuel consumption. That's happening for economic reasons. We can accelerate that, and I think there's a lot of positive that's there. But as I like to tell people, you can celebrate scoring a touchdown without assuming that the game is over. And we got a lot more plays to run.
I typically hold surveys on the first day of class that ask a bunch of questions, but one of which is whether a student has voted before. And typically I get around 15% or so voter turnout. And partly it's an age issue where sometimes incoming freshmen maybe just are 18 and haven't had the opportunity yet. What do you make of that? Just low. We see that surveys showing that younger people are kind of less engaged right now. So what can you say to the traditional kind of 18 to 29-year-old who generally has the lowest voter turnout of why it's important to vote, or why they should be more civically involved?
So just to state the obvious, there has never been a time in our history when older generations have not criticized younger generations for not voting enough, right? The boomers were not good at voting when they were 18 years old. They're good at voting now. And, if you look at, well, the best analysis I've seen of why that is I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ab Mikva, used to be a representative from the North Shore in Illinois. His grandson, Jake, got involved in one of our first campaigns, and they've got an ongoing family charitable effort dedicated to increasing youth turnout. And what they found is that the single biggest reason why youth turnout is always low is because voting tends to be driven by how connected you are to your local community. And if you're your age, you're at the point in your life where it's probably, you've just moved out of your parents' home for the first time. You may be living in a community you haven't lived in before. You don't necessarily perceive yourself as staying in this community for a long time because you're going to go to school, you're going to go out, it's your first job, you're going to move from there. And there just isn't the kind of connection that says, I really care about the local school board, I really care about local property taxes, I really care about local services, that tends to drive that engagement. And what they had advocated for, which unfortunately we didn't get as an amendment in one of the bills, but I've consistently sponsored, is saying we should drop the voting age to 16. And their logic for it is that in every generation, the highest propensity voter, at least since the 19th Amendment has been passed, has always been 55 to 65-year-old women. They're good voters. The average 16-year-old lives with a 55 to 65-year-old woman. and so if you sort of get voting started at an age where you're home, because there is a lot of evidence that once you start voting, you tend to continue. But I think we put the burden for voting on folks at a young age. My urging of you to vote is that if you look at issues that are hugely important to youth voters and issues that Congress prioritizes, you can see that differential response, right? You can't touch Social Security and Medicare because that's a huge concern for senior voters. And yet we can't get the Senate to take up a vote on gun violence, right? Student debt, why are these things so much harder? And I don't want you to come away and say it's because politicians are cynical and looking after their voters, but we do go out and do polls to figure out what is the thing that most matters to voters in my district so that I can be responsive. And if you've ever gotten a call from a pollster, you know that the first question is, how likely are you to vote in the next election? And if the answer is no, the call ends. And so you end up, I think, having this blind spot where issues that we know from public polling are really interesting. Climate change would be a real obvious example. Public polling says that is a massively popular issue. Electoral polling says voters don't care about it. That gap, I think, is responded by who hangs up the phone after that first question. And so just by being a voter and by pollsters saying this is someone who matters as a voter means now all of a sudden, politicians who may be, blind to these issues are forced to come up to speed that say, if I want to win my next election, I'm going to have something on this issue. So do vote.
And related to that last comment, in my American government class, we were just recently talking about theories of representation for members of Congress. And according to a textbook, there's this idea of a delegate, that the member of Congress, you're just simply taking the place of us. And so you should do what we want, and you might gauge that based on opinion polls or how many calls or emails come into your office, or that you're a trustee, like you're kind of the expert, especially in related to science issues. It's better for you to do what you know is best because we might not be very knowledgeable on that. And sometimes we also talk about like a partisan model, that if you're a Democrat, you kind of just vote party lines. Can you tell us, just maybe either for yourself or in general, which of those are, do you think, more accurate, or does it depend? Do you go back and use multiple of those kind of theories or aspects of representation in guiding you to make decisions? So
I am very much of the trustee philosophy. whether good or bad, you can agree, disagree. It's where my head works. And I just say that whatever judgment I have in my answer, understand where I'm coming from. I don't actually know practically. I think the theory of the delegate model is interesting. In practice, you walk to the floor and there's a late amendment on how we should structure a vote on TikTok, right? Anybody who says, well, I'm going to vote the way my constituents want me to vote on this is lying to you, because they have no idea what their constituents actually want. You didn't go out and do a statistically significant sample of the poll. You know that the people who are calling your office are not a representative sample. They're the people who are really fired up in one such or the other. You know the people who showed up at your town hall are not a representative sample of the electorate, especially if you're a long way before an election. And so all you really have is a lot of noise and data points. Even the letters you get, it's not really representative. But I think within the trustee model, if you go out and you tell people before your election, after your election, during your election, these are the values I have, this is how I think about problems, these are where my red lines are as far as things that are important to me, and this is how I'll vote. If they vote for you on that, you're now empowered to use that judgment. In that wonderful Burkean line that you owe the voters your judgment, and you betray them if you sacrifice it to their opinion. If they don't vote for you, all right, well, that's a lesson as well, right? But I think it's much easier to go back to the voters in a subsequent election and say, I am who I told you I was, than to say, my opinions will blow like the wind depending on who called our office last week. And that's a very judgy way to say it, because I have respect for my colleagues who play this in a different way. I just don't know practically, outside of a theoretical textbook scenario, where you would actually operate with the delegate model. But I know how you operate with the trustee model in an honest way.
Yeah, I'll follow up. You mentioned TikTok. Surveys on my first day also indicate that many of my students know TikTok pretty well. And recently, there was some legislation in the last week that passed regarding TikTok. So could you tell us a little bit about that legislation and what guided you in your vote on that? I wish the media would describe this as a TikTok divestiture rather than a TikTok ban, because that's what it was. There are laws on the books that are good laws and that I think we're all grateful for, that says that if a foreign company buys a U.S. company, there are certain processes that have to be gone through to make sure that there's no national security concerns that are going through. So, imagine if a Russian company wanted to buy a U.S. defense contractor, we might legitimately say that's a concern. We want to go through and check. Or if one of our adversaries wanted to buy a major U.S. bank and impact the economy, you would understand that. There's quite a bit of evidence that TikTok as a company that is majority owned by a division of the Chinese Communist Party. And I emphasize CCP. This is not about whether it's China. This is about that it's that part of the Chinese government that has some adversarial issues with the United States, that they have been significantly suppressing what shows up on TikTok. Less so in the United States, although there is some evidence that certain things are much, you don't see as much about the Taiwanese democracy movement in your TikTok feed as you might see about other issues. But there's been very intentional use that we've been able to see, particularly in other countries, that have been consistent with Chinese interests, but not necessarily the interests of that entity. There was a case that got much less attention, but is worth following. This was about 4 or 5 years ago, where a Chinese Communist Party entity had bought a controlling stake in Grindr, Grindr, the gay dating app, and there was a forced divestiture of that because of a recognition that this could be weaponized to, disclose people's private lives, create some awkwardness. And so under this law, the government said, you are going to be forced to divest. They sold Grindr. Grindr still exists. It still operates. We just have less concern about whether private data will go through. The TikTok situation was made a little bit more complicated because there was no purchase by the CCP of a U.S. entity. It was the creation of an entity that then became a
became this platform that 170 million Americans look at on a pretty regular basis. And so what we had to do legally was say we don't have the law that allows us to block the purchase or to step back on the purchase as we did with Grindr because there was no foreign entity purchasing a U.S. company. And so what we voted on was to say, okay, given the size of this, given the impact, given what we're seeing around the world, we are going to compel a divestiture, as happened with Grindr, using the same principles of the law. And somebody will want to own this because it's a valuable property and it'll go on. But that was what we did because I think there's a legitimate concern that when you have so many people getting their information from something that has demonstrated a desire to amplify things that are in the national interests of a country other than the United States, that's not a healthy thing for democracy.
So this next one is a little bit of I'm long-winded with my questions, but
I'm long-winded with my answers, that's all right.
This is an important topic, especially for my American government students, the concept of gerrymandering. So those of you who don't know, once upon a time, there was a governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, and Representative Casten represents a specific district in Illinois. And this former governor of Massachusetts created a congressional district in the state of Massachusetts. It looked like a salamander. They took his name gerrymandering. We often pronounce it gerrymandering. So it's really when you're kind of politically motivated redistricting, creating district boundary lines that might favor one party. Sometimes we also create minority-majority districts where a specific racial or ethnic group becomes a majority in one specific congressional district. And sometimes we do redistricting to favor or hurt an incumbent. So with that as kind of context, what you may not know is that Representative Casten, because Illinois lost a House of Representatives seat, we went, 18 to 17, if I'm not mistaken. And so we lose this House of Representatives seat, and so all of our districts are going to change quite significantly. Representative Casten is now representing a district that is 77% new, according to the data that I found. So two things with that as context. How challenging is it to adjust to representing such a new territory, new district, and now it's largely the southwest suburbs that includes Moraine Valley? And then maybe just thoughts in general about gerrymandering?
Yeah, so let me give a little bit of history just on the personal side, and then we can go to thoughts in general on gerrymandering. In 2010, Illinois also lost a seat. We went from 19 to 18. Illinois is one of the states that it is legal to do totally partisan redistricting in Illinois. Some states that's not the case. In Illinois it is. Both in 2010 and 2020, the Democrats were in control and did a partisan redistrict. In 2010, the Illinois legislature said we are going to box out one Republican, and they forced Peter Roskam and Judy Biggert to fight over essentially one Republican seat in the suburbs and drew a district that was designed to pack all of the Republican voters into one district. That had been Henry Hyde's district before. Peter Roskam won. That is the district that I flipped in 2018. So that was the Republican vote sink. And so, demographics move. You have fantastic candidates, of course, who are capable of flipping these seats. So gerrymandering is not a certain thing. These things do evolve over time. And when the new districts came out, really in 2022, right? Because you redraw the maps in 2020, so then you run on those maps in 2022. It's true, I was 77% new terrain. I took comfort in the fact that, just a few years before I'd run in a district where I didn't know 100% of the voters, so knowing 25 seemed like I was really moving in the right direction. The redistricting process, I think, is actually healthy because I have a very different set of demographics. I went from representing the 12th wealthiest congressional district in the country, Barrington, Hinsdale, St. Charles, Naperville, to representing a district that has the highest percentage of union households of any district in Illinois. Orland Park, Oak Lawn, Tinley Park. It's a very different demography, and I think I'm better at my job because you get more exposure to a broader array when this redistricting happens, which is still only 2 districts, but I think there's some value in that. With respect to gerrymandering, It's horrible. We should stop it. It goes back to these rules about like minority versus majority protection. And it's truly a tragedy that in 2018 when I came in, we had the biggest freshman class since Watergate. Everybody said this is this huge, this huge rebuke to, to Trumpism and the Women's March and all that came through on that. And yet 90% of the members of Congress who were running for election that cycle won their reelection. Like, think about it, that you have this like huge rebuke and 90% of the incumbents still win, in spite of the fact that Congress at that point had like 30% favorability. That's a result of the fact that so many districts are drawn to be non-competitive. I think the challenge in fixing that is that for states like Illinois that have a strong Democratic majority and the ability to partisanly draw districts, there are also states like Texas that have a strong Republican majority and the ability to partisanly redraw their districts. And so everybody is sort of deadlocked in this, I don't want to unilaterally disarm, because if I give up on this end, we're going to lose our ability to influence Congress for the issues that we care about, whether you're a Texan or in Illinois and in the legislature. And so ultimately what we really have to do is to fix that federally. We have written and passed twice H.R. 1 that would essentially mandate nonpartisan map making. We passed it out of the House in 2 terms. We've never gotten the Senate to bring it up. I will remind you that the Senate is not designed to reflect the will of the majority. It's a really, really popular bill, but we need to use federal policy to essentially mandate a unilateral disarmament. And just to give you some sense of what I think is possible when you do that, a number of years ago I did some work with the Chicago Council of Global Affairs on immigration policy. And they hosted the National Conference of State Legislators. So state legislators from all 50 states came in specifically to talk about how immigration policy was working in their district. And hands down, the most thoughtful person that I met there was a Republican from Iowa, state senator. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, I wouldn't have expected such thoughtfulness to come out of an Iowa Republican. I don't mean to be like stereotypical about it, but that's not exactly what you think of as like a hotbed of progressivism on immigration policy. And he said it's entirely because of our redistricting rules. That he said in Iowa at the state level, not at the federal level, their maps are drawn by computer. The new census comes out, the census says this is where the population has moved from last time. You have to create districts that are roughly equivalent in population. And the computer spits out a map that is consistent with the Voting Rights Act, with all the various rules, pardon me. And each party then has one black ball. If you don't like that map, you can drop your black ball, say spit out a new map, but then you have to live with whatever the next map is. And he said the practical result is that it forces Iowa state legislators to be both more, we're not in packed districts that are packed with our voters, but we also don't know whether in the next time there's a redistricting that comes out, whether we're going to have any ability to influence whether we get voters. And he said it just forces, more civility and more openness in the system. And that's what we could have, right? But we need to do that nationally.
So I have another question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. And so if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll come around with the microphone. So we've also in my class recently talked about how, in general, in recent years, Congress has been pretty gridlocked, where the number of bills that become a law are relatively few, and that sometimes major issues are often ignored. And you talked about some of the topics of gun reform and so forth. And the question is whether, do you believe that's led to maybe a more powerful Supreme Court, where now the Supreme Court often is in a position of ruling on executive orders, or because Congress hasn't updated the Clean Air Act or something like that, they're kind of making interpretations that there needs to be a new or updated version from Congress, perhaps knowing that Congress is unlikely to have a new update to laws?
So let me just first challenge a little bit the premise of your question. It is certainly true that this Congress has not gotten a lot done. I would point out that the prior Congress that had similarly very small majorities going the other direction. Passed the biggest infrastructure bill in our history, the biggest climate bill in our history, the CHIPS and Science Act, huge injections of money and relief to recover from COVID. It was actually one of the most productive Congresses in history. So I think there's a rich conversation about the dynamics of this term and some of the challenges that the internal fights within the Republican Party that have frustrated that process. But I wouldn't want you to leave believing that Congress has been woefully unproductive consistently. This term is a separate conversation. With respect to the courts, it's an issue near and dear to my heart that I think in theory, we have three co-equal branches of government. I think if you want to be an originalist, rightly or wrongly, I think you could make a strong case that our founders thought that the legislative branch was the supreme entity. It's where all the people were. It's the longest section of the Constitution. When our founders built the Capitol, they built it in the tallest spot on the hill. They oriented the city around the Capitol. The Supreme Court was a tenant in the Capitol. They rented a room from us, and the executive branch consisted of two people. Right? That was the government that was founded. I'm not saying rightly or wrongly, but I think the founders' vision was that Congress would write the laws, Congress would have the power of the purse, the executive branch would implement them and be commander-in-chief of the military, and the Supreme Court would make sure that we were following the laws. I think as you go forward from that first vision, I can identify a ton of places where either the executive branch or the judicial branch has expanded power at the expense of the legislative. Marbury versus Madison was a giant power grab over the legislative branch. I'm not saying right or wrong, right? But Marbury versus Madison all of a sudden said that the Supreme Court could determine whether what Congress did was constitutional. The Congress has, I think, more often than not, when faced with a hard challenge, given power to the executive branch rather than fixing it ourselves. Think about when Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the Cuyahoga River is on fire. We're very concerned about the environment. Congress did not respond by saying, let us legislate how to clean up the environment. Congress responded by saying, let us create an executive branch agency, the EPA, who will be tasked with fixing this. And so we essentially created a branch of government to do that. And that's true for huge expansions of the executive branch. The U.S. has about a $7 trillion annual budget that we spend. Of that, less than 0.1% is the legislative branch. And so so I think whether it's the court expanding jurisdiction with some of these, the Chevron ruling, which would be horrible if that went through, or the executive branch expanding jurisdiction, I think we're past due for the legislative branch to take some power back. Dahlia Lithwick, who I don't know if you've read her, wonderful writer on the court, recently met with us and was admonishing us to do this, and she said that Article 3 says that the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction over matters of maritime law, admiralty law, disputes between the states, and such appellate jurisdiction as Congress may see fit to provide. She was like, you have the power to limit all their jurisdiction. And then said, Congress has in the past actually compelled Supreme Court justices to ride circuit, buy a horse, ride around the country, stay at inns. Like, you have chosen not to exercise that power, but you still have that power. And I'm not saying that in a tit-for-tat sense, but I do think that if we are to have three co-equal branches of government, and you can't point to a point in history, maybe with the exception of the War Powers Act, that the legislative branch has ever flexed relative to the other two, but you can find countless examples the other way. I think the system is a little tilted away from where it should be right now.
All right. And again, this is most likely your House of Representative if you live in the southwest suburbs. So now's your time. If you have a question for Representative Casten, if you could raise your hand, and I'll come around.
Hello, good morning, and first and foremost, thank you for coming out to Moraine and being willing to answer questions. My name's Aaron, and regarding my question, in last year, July 13th, Senator Klobuchar, who I'm sure you're familiar with, introduced a legislation called the Afghan Adjustment Act. Now, I've been advocating for this for around a year now with the local speech and debate team, and as representing the district, I want to know your stance on this legislation and the reasoning behind it.
And just to remind me, this was the bill that would have increased the number of special immigrant visas for Afghanis, or am I confusing that with another bill?
This, I believe, I understand that bill, but this bill would provide the permanent residential status to the ones who did serve alongside the U.S.
Yeah. So let me speak to the general issue because I don't want to misstate exactly the precision of that bill. We absolutely should do it, and don't limit ourselves to Afghanis. I just recently met with an Iraqi who was sponsored by a group in Wheaton and has come over here and obtained a visa, and it took him 10 years, and he worked as an interpreter for the U.S. Army. Did not feel safe in post-Iraq war Iraq, and yet he was an ally of ours and was sort of had all this uncertainty in his life. Crazily enough, he worked as an interpreter for Seth Moulton, who's a member of Congress who was stationed in Iraq, and it still took him 10 years to go through and now end up living in Wheaton. And I think American immigration policy writ large has always been too focused on countries of origin and not enough focused on need and humanitarian issues. This is not a funny joke, but I do often make the joke that the only thing consistent about American immigration policy is that we're racist towards someone. Who we are racist against, sometimes it's the Irish, sometimes it's the Italians, sometimes it's the Jews, sometimes it's Muslims, but we've always had groups of favored and disfavored immigrants who we've not gone through. So the specific issue of people who have helped out U.S. foreign interests overseas, my goodness, let's be helpful for those folks. I think a lot of the challenge that we can't fix this without comprehensive immigration reform, and we keep trying to piecemeal it, is that as our immigration policy sits right now, we have favored countries that we recruit from, and broadly speaking, that tends to disfavor high population countries relative to what a skills-based immigration system would look like. If we just looked at where are the gaps in our economy, where do people want to come from, we would overwhelmingly be dominated by Indian and Chinese immigrants, not because they are more skilled, but because there's more of them. And so as we've talked about how you right-size our immigration policy, you get this tension between, on the one hand, Indian and Chinese immigrants who are here who would like to bring the rest of their family over, who, maybe they're here and a cousin came over to study in the United States and did their PhD, invented something fantastic, and now we can't even get them a work visa. So there's that pressure on the other side. On the other side are the lower population countries who are still waiting to get their own family members over and would be disfavored if we shifted through. And there's been a lot of back and forth around how do you get to a skills-based immigration system, but get there with some kind of a transition that doesn't immediately penalize folks who made certain life decisions based on the current rules. And, that's a little bit beyond the specifics of your question, but it sort of is overhanging a lot of these conversations that when you look at this and say, this small piece is a problem and we could fix it, even among people who agree with that, you'll find people saying, yeah, but I want that chip on the table when we finally get to the point to do the whole comprehensive, because I don't want to lose the ability to work that into the package. And that's an excuse. It's to my first point of you go where the votes are that you have. I realize there's a tension between what I think we should be doing and what we are likely to do, but I think we just have to keep pushing in the direction of saying we need to get to a point that is a skills-based system that does prioritize folks who have clearly made a lot of personal sacrifices on behalf of our country.
Thank you. Great question. Other questions?
morning. I just had a question. Legislation on Tuesday passed a law in Tennessee allowing teachers in schools to be armed. I'm going to school right now to become a future educator of America. And I just want to know your opinion on what that looks like for Illinois or for the rest of the country. Do you think this is something that Illinois would be open to passing as well?
So I can't speak to the Illinois legislature other than the character of my friends who are there, and I'm quite certain that that's not going to become a law in Illinois. It's ridiculously scary to me. I mean, the idea that all the things we ask educators to do, you know, not only to teach, but, you know, if you're in the public school system, we also want to make sure that we've got, you know, people have appropriate nutrition, that they've got, you know, after school programs if families can't get there, that there's busing to bring people back and forth. They're the things that we want a public education to do for our community that are included but not limited to getting a good grade on your SATs, right? The idea that anybody thinks it would be productive to say, and in addition, I'd like you to pack heat and be prepared to shoot someone. Like that's just insane to me. Like I don't think anything good comes out of that. I think also that it is objectively true that the more guns exist in your community on a per capita basis, the more likely you are to get shot on a per capita basis. Hands down, the most dangerous state in the country is Wyoming. Now, that's not necessarily homicides because the largest cause of gun death is suicides, but putting more guns into a community, there's no statistical evidence that makes anybody safer. Well, I can give you a lot of opinions beyond that, but, you know, all backed up with robust facts, but I think there's a much bigger chance that Tennessee law causes to somebody inadvertently getting shot than that it saves any lives. And thank you for considering a career in education.
So once again, I want to thank Representative Casten for coming today and answering so many questions. I want to thank all of you for coming. It's great to see all of you here. I know some of you were brought by your faculty, so thank you, faculty members, for coming today. Thank you to Dr. Haney and Dr. Battle. Thank you to Multimedia. Really appreciate all of your guys' help and getting us going today, Tom, Tim, Jeff. And I want to just, on behalf of Moraine Valley and my American government class, we'd like to offer you a small token of our appreciation. Thank you. All right. Thanks again, everybody. I really appreciate all of your attendance today and your great questions. Thank you.